The fluorescent lights in room 237 flickered with the persistence of a dying insect, casting intermittent shadows across water-stained ceiling tiles that had witnessed decades of academic mediocrity. Mrs. Patricia Davidson adjusted her reading glasses with the precision of a sniper acquiring a target, her gaze sweeping across the assembled sophomores like a predator cataloguing prey. The motivational posters peeling from the walls, "Reach for the stars and believe in yourself," seemed to mock the institutional despair that permeated every corner of Roosevelt High School. "Now, class," Mrs. Davidson's voice cut through the morning lethargy with surgical sharpness. "Today we're discussing the importance of honest self-assessment. Too many students in this district seem to believe that fabricating accomplishments will somehow magically transform their circumstances." She paused, allowing her words to settle like sediment in stagnant water. Her fingers drummed against the gradebook that had become both her weapon and her shield, a leather-bound testament to 23 years of realistic expectations and carefully managed disappointments. Marcus Rivera sat in the back corner as he had every day for 3 months, his second-hand composition notebook open to a page covered in meticulous handwriting. The 17-year-old's shoulders carried the weight of someone far older, and his dark eyes held the particular stillness that comes from surviving things that would break most people. His jeans were clean, but worn thin at the knees. His sneakers held together with carefully applied duct tape that he'd colored black with a Sharpie to make it less obvious. "Mr. Rivera?" Mrs. Davidson's attention locked onto him with the inevitability of gravity. "Since you seem so absorbed in your writing, perhaps you'd like to share with the class what's so fascinating." The room fell silent, except for the persistent clank of radiators that had been fighting a losing battle against winter since the Carter administration. Marcus looked up slowly, his expression neutral, in the way that children learn when showing emotion becomes a liability. "I was taking notes on yesterday's lesson about multilingual literature," he said quietly, his voice carrying an accent that seemed to shift and settle like water finding its level. Mrs. Davidson's eyebrows rose with theatrical skepticism. "Multilingual literature? How ambitious!" She closed her gradebook with a snap that echoed like a gavel. "And what languages would you be studying, Mr. Rivera? Spanish, I assume, given your background." There it was, the casual assumption wrapped in professional courtesy, the reduction of a human being to a demographic checkbox. Marcus had heard variations of this conversation countless times in countless classrooms from countless teachers who looked at his file and saw only statistics: foster care, frequent school transfers, free lunch program. "I speak 5 languages, Marcus said simply, his tone as level as if he'd announced the time of day. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with the particular electricity that precedes either laughter or lightning. A few students shifted in their seats, sensing the approaching storm. Jennifer Walsh, who sat 2 rows ahead, turned slightly to get a better view of the impending spectacle. Mrs. Davidson's laugh started as a small sound, barely more than a chuckle, but it grew with each second until it filled the room like smoke. 5 languages, she repeated, savoring each syllable. 5 languages. She turned to address the class, as if Marcus had suddenly become invisible. "Class, this is exactly what I was talking about. The tendency to embellish, to create elaborate fantasies rather than focusing on achievable goals." She walked to the whiteboard and picked up a red marker, the color she reserved for corrections and failures. "Mr. Rivera, since you're so accomplished, perhaps you'd enlighten us. What are these 5 languages?" Marcus remained seated, his hands folded calmly on his desk. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet dignity that seemed to absorb the fluorescent harshness of the room. "English, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, and Russian." The red marker squeaked against the whiteboard as Mrs. Davidson wrote each language in precise, mocking letters. "Mandarin Chinese," she repeated with exaggerated pronunciation. Arabic, Russian. She turned back to face him, her smile sharp as broken glass. And where exactly did a foster child from Roosevelt High acquire such impressive linguistic skills? The United Nations. A few students laughed, the nervous, uncomfortable sound of people watching a car accident they can't prevent. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the way his body remembered trauma even when his mind stayed calm. But he'd learned long ago that the truth, delivered quietly and without defense, often carried more power than any argument. "I learned them from the people who took care of me," he said. Mrs. Davidson sensed vulnerability the way sharks sense blood. She moved closer to his desk, her heels clicking against the linoleum with predatory rhythm. "The people who took care of you. Foster families, you mean?" "Not exactly." "Then who exactly, Mr. Rivera? Because I've been teaching for 23 years and I can spot a fabrication from across the room. Children don't simply absorb languages like sponges unless they're in very specific, very privileged circumstances. And your file," she gestured toward her desk, where a manila folder lay open, "doesn't suggest privilege." Marcus looked down at his notebook, where he'd been writing vocabulary words in multiple scripts, Arabic flowing right to left, Chinese characters in neat columns, Cyrillic letters that looked like secrets only he could read. His pen had stopped moving when she'd called his name, leaving a small dot of blue ink where his concentration had broken. "I learned them because I had to," he said finally. "Had to?" Mrs. Davidson's voice rose with theatrical incredulity. "What possible circumstance could require a teenage foster child to master 5 languages? Are you claiming some sort of special program? Some elite linguistic academy that takes in troubled youth?" The word troubled hung in the air like a slur. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but a cold recognition of what was happening. This wasn't about languages or education or even his academic honesty. This was about power, about a woman who needed someone smaller to break in order to feel whole. He looked up at her then, and for just a moment Mrs. Davidson saw something in his dark eyes that made her step back involuntarily. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was the kind of deep, still water that reflects everything but reveals nothing of what lies beneath. "Sometimes you learn things because not learning them means you don't survive," Marcus said quietly. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the radiators seemed to hold their breath. Mrs. Davidson felt a strange chill, as if someone had opened a window to let in air from a place much colder and darker than her comfortable suburban world could imagine. But she was too committed to the performance now, too invested in maintaining her authority to acknowledge the warning in his voice. She straightened her shoulders and returned to the whiteboard, where the list of languages stood like an indictment written in red ink. "Mr. Rivera, I appreciate creativity, but this classroom requires honesty above all else. Perhaps instead of fantasizing about linguistic abilities, you might focus on mastering standard English composition. Your writing, while adequate, shows room for significant improvement." She picked up his notebook without asking permission, flipping through pages covered in his careful handwriting. What she saw there made her pause. Notes in multiple languages, translations, vocabulary lists that moved between scripts with fluid competence. For a moment, doubt crept in like water through a crack in concrete. But Mrs. Davidson had built her career on certainty, on the comfortable assumption that she could read people like open books. She'd seen too many students lie about their abilities, their circumstances, their achievements. She knew the patterns, the tells, the desperate fabrications that kids use to try to make themselves special. She handed the notebook back to him with a dismissive gesture. "Very impressive copying, Mr. Rivera. Google Translate has certainly made plagiarism more sophisticated, but true linguistic competence requires more than copied characters and memorized phrases." Marcus took the notebook without protest, his fingers careful not to brush against hers. He could smell her perfume, something expensive and chemical that reminded him of the waiting rooms where social workers had discussed his future in voices they thought he couldn't understand. "Would you like me to demonstrate?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Davidson's smile sharpened. "Oh, absolutely. Please regale us with your linguistic prowess. Let's start with something simple. Tell the class about yourself in one of these languages. Spanish should be manageable, given your obvious heritage." She expected him to stumble, to mumble a few memorized phrases, to expose himself as just another kid trying to be more than his circumstances allowed. What she didn't expect was the way Marcus straightened in his chair, the way his entire presence seemed to shift and solidify. When he spoke, it wasn't in Spanish at all. The words that filled the room were flowing, musical Arabic, delivered with the kind of regional specificity that takes years to acquire. His voice carried the particular cadences of someone who had lived in the language, not just studied it. Mrs. Davidson's smile faltered. She didn't speak Arabic, but she could hear the confidence in his pronunciation, the way the words connected with natural rhythm. This wasn't Google Translate. This wasn't memorized phrases. Marcus switched to Mandarin without pause, his tones precise and natural, then to Russian, where his voice took on a different quality, harder, more careful, with the kind of pronunciation that suggested familiarity with Moscow streets rather than academic instruction. When he finished, the classroom remained silent. Mrs. Davidson stood frozen at the whiteboard, the red marker still in her hand, her mouth slightly open, as if she'd been about to speak, but had forgotten the words. "You asked what I said," Marcus continued in English, his voice still quiet but somehow filling every corner of the room. "I told them about a teacher who believes that suffering makes children liars, and privilege is the only path to knowledge. I told them about a woman who looks at a foster child and sees only limitation, only problems to be managed rather than potential to be nurtured." Mrs. Davidson's face flushed red as the marker in her hand. "Mr. Rivera, that's quite enough. I told them about someone who's never had to learn languages to survive, who's never been moved from place to place where speaking the wrong tongue in the wrong accent could mean punishment or worse. Someone who can't imagine that a child might collect languages the way other children collect scars." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down on ancient dueling grounds. Mrs. Davidson felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the cold recognition that she was facing an opponent she didn't understand, armed with weapons she didn't recognize. But Patricia Davidson had not built her reputation by backing down from students, no matter how articulate or unsettling they might be. She was the authority here, the professional, the adult, with 2 decades of experience managing children who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. "Mr. Rivera," she said, her voice tight with the kind of control that comes from years of practice, "I don't know what game you're playing, but this classroom is not the place for elaborate performances. If you genuinely possess these skills, which I seriously doubt, then you can prove it through proper academic channels. Until then, I suggest you focus on the curriculum at hand." She turned back to the whiteboard, dismissing him with the gesture, and began erasing the list of languages as if eliminating the evidence would somehow restore her control over the narrative. Marcus watched her erase each word with movements that grew increasingly aggressive, the red ink disappearing under broad strokes of the eraser. He understood something fundamental in that moment. This wasn't about language at all. This was about a woman who needed the world to be simple, predictable, controllable. A woman who couldn't allow for the possibility that someone like him might possess something she couldn't categorize or diminish. He opened his notebook and continued writing, his pen moving across the page with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 4 years of hell and back into something resembling safety. He wrote in English this time, recording everything, her words, her tone, her assumptions. He'd learned to document everything, to preserve evidence of the moments when authority revealed its true face. Mrs. Davidson finished erasing the board and turned back to the class, her professional smile restored like armor, hastily reassembled. "Now then, let's continue with our discussion of honest self-assessment and appropriate academic goals." But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The other students sensed it. a change in the equilibrium, a crack in the foundation of assumed power. They looked between Marcus, still writing in his careful script, and Mrs. Davidson, whose smile seemed to require more effort than it had 30 minutes earlier. The bell rang, sharp and final. Students began gathering their belongings with the practiced efficiency of people escaping a crime scene. Marcus closed his notebook carefully, placed his pen in the spiral binding, and stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had said everything that needed saying. As he walked toward the door, Mrs. Davidson called after him. "Mr. Rivera, a word." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Yes, ma'am? I hope you understand that this classroom requires honesty and respect. Disrupting class with elaborate fabrications isn't the path to success here." Marcus turned slowly, and when he looked at her, Mrs. Davidson saw something in his eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was the kind of quiet certainty that comes from someone who has survived things that would break other people, someone who has learned to recognize truth from a distance that most people never have to travel. "I understand completely," he said quietly. "I understand exactly what this classroom requires." He walked out into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights continued their dying flicker and the radiators clanked their familiar rhythm of institutional decay. Behind him, Mrs. Davidson stood alone in her empty classroom, staring at the whiteboard where the ghost of erased letters seemed to linger like accusations she couldn't quite remove. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made the kind of mistake that would reshape everything she thought she understood about power, authority, and the dangerous assumption that suffering makes children weak rather than wise. Marcus Rivera walked down the hallway toward his next class, his notebook tucked under his arm, carrying secrets that would soon transform a simple academic disagreement into something much larger, much more dangerous, and infinitely more final than Mrs. Davidson's comfortable world could possibly imagine. The rule had been established. In her classroom, truth was whatever she decided it was. The breach had occurred. Marcus Rivera had quietly, calmly demonstrated that some truths are too large to be contained by anyone's assumptions, and somewhere in the space between those two realities, the machinery of justice had begun its slow, inexorable turn. The Sudzone laundromat at 2:47 a.m. existed in a pocket of fluorescent purgatory, where the smell of industrial fabric softener mixed with the desperate loneliness of people washing their lives in public. Marcus Rivera sat at a folding table that wobbled with each rotation of the nearby machines, his textbook propped against a plastic basket, while he worked through calculus problems that his guidance counselor had insisted were too advanced for someone in his situation. The phrase had followed him through 6 foster homes, 14 schools, and countless meetings where adults discussed his future in voices that suggested they'd already written the ending. The recording device, disguised as a broken iPod with a cracked screen and frayed earbuds, sat beside his calculator. To anyone watching, it looked like the kind of obsolete technology that broke teenagers carried because they couldn't afford anything better. In reality, it was a sophisticated digital recorder that his sister Elena had pressed into his hands during their last moments together 4 years ago, whispering in rapid Spanish about keeping voices safe, about remembering everything. Marcus had been documenting everything ever since. The notebook beside him wasn't filled with just homework. 3/4 of the pages contained meticulous records written in 5 languages, each entry dated and cross-referenced. Conversations overheard in hallways, comments from teachers who thought foster kids couldn't understand subtext, administrators discussing problem students in voices that dripped with predetermined conclusions, and Mrs. Davidson. 3 months of careful observation had filled 17 pages with her words, her patterns, her assumptions. Marcus wrote in different languages depending on the content: English for direct quotes, Spanish for emotional observations, Arabic for the things that reminded him of darker times. He'd learned to separate information into categories the way a forensic investigator might catalogue evidence, because that's what this was, really. Evidence. The washing machine nearest him entered its spin cycle with a mechanical violence that made the entire table shudder. Marcus steadied his notebook and continued writing, his pen moving across the page in the neat script that had once earned him praise from teachers who actually bothered to look at his work rather than his file. October 15th, third period English. Mr. Rivera seems to confuse effort with accomplishment. Writing extensively doesn't compensate for lack of substance. P. Davidson, spoken to student-teacher Miss Chen while reviewing my essay on linguistic displacement in refugee populations. Note: essay received B, despite demonstrating understanding of socio-linguistic theory typically taught at graduate level. Same day, Jennifer Walsh received A for 5-paragraph essay on Why Books Are Important, containing 3 factual errors and minimal analytical depth. Observed, P. Davidson spent 12 minutes critiquing my citation format, 3 minutes on actual content analysis. Marcus paused in his writing, listening to the familiar symphony of the laundromat, the rhythmic churning of washers, the mechanical breathing of dryers, the occasional clank of coins in the change machine. These sounds had become the soundtrack to his education, the background noise against which he taught himself advanced mathematics, literary analysis, and the careful art of documentation. His phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Singh at the Legal Aid Clinic, where he volunteered on weekends, translating for immigrant families who navigated legal proceedings in languages they were still learning. Marcus, can you come in tomorrow? Family from Syria needs help with custody paperwork. Your Arabic skills could make the difference between keeping children together or splitting them up. He typed back, Of course. 9 a.m.? Perfect. Also, how's school? Any issues with that teacher you mentioned? Marcus stared at the text for a long moment. Dr. Singh had fled Afghanistan as a child, arriving in America with nothing but trauma and a fierce intelligence that had eventually earned her both a law degree and a PhD in forensic linguistics. She understood things that most adults couldn't, the way survival shapes learning, the way children develop skills that don't fit into neat academic categories. She also understood the importance of evidence. Gathering documentation. Will have comprehensive report soon. Be careful, Marcus. Some people don't like being seen clearly. He deleted the text thread and returned to his notebook. The next entry was written in Mandarin, the characters flowing down the page with the precision his memory insisted upon. October 22nd, before class observation. P. Davidson, reviewing files with guidance counselor Mrs. Patterson. Overheard through partially open door. The Rivera boy is clearly intelligent, but these foster kids often develop manipulative behaviors. They learn to tell adults what they want to hear. We need to be realistic about his potential rather than encouraging unrealistic expectations. His test scores suggest test scores can be misleading. I've seen too many bright kids from unstable backgrounds flame out when they hit real challenges. Better to guide him toward practical goals. Community college, maybe vocational training. Mrs. Patterson. His essay on post-conflict linguistics was remarkable. Dr. Chen from the university said it demonstrated graduate-level understanding. Plagiarism is sophisticated now. Internet makes it easy to copy academic language. I'd rather focus on building genuine skills than inflating his ego with false praise. Marcus had stood in that hallway for 7 minutes, listening to his future being decided by someone who had never asked him about his past, his dreams, or his plans. Someone who looked at his circumstances and saw only limitations. He turned the page and continued in Russian, the Cyrillic letters forming words that carried the weight of older, darker memories. Pattern recognition, P. Davidson exhibits classic defense mechanisms of someone whose worldview depends on maintaining hierarchical assumptions. Any evidence that contradicts her preconceptions about class, background, and potential triggers escalatory responses. Psychological profile suggests deep insecurity masked by professional authority. Divorce proceedings began 6 months ago. Husband left for younger colleague. Performance reviews show increased friction with students and parents since personal crisis began. Vulnerability needs to be right about student assessments to maintain professional self-worth. Public correction or contradiction triggers disproportionate defensive responses. A dryer buzzed, its cycle complete. Marcus folded his notebook closed and walked over to retrieve his clothes. 3 pairs of jeans, 5 t-shirts, socks and underwear that he washed every 3 days whether they needed it or not. Routine was armor against chaos. Cleanliness was dignity when everything else could be taken away. As he folded his clothes into the plastic basket, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Elena. Elena, his sister who wasn't supposed to contact him, who was supposed to be safely placed in a family 3 states away, who was supposed to be healing from the same trauma that had taught him 5 languages and given him an eidetic memory for voices that carried threats in multiple tongues. Hermano, are you safe? Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Elena never texted except in emergencies. Their contact was supposed to be limited, supervised, filtered through social workers who monitored their communication for signs of unhealthy attachment or trauma bonding. Yes, you need to talk. Voice call. Now. He looked around the empty laundromat, calculating risks. The security camera in the corner had been broken for 2 months. The night manager was passed out in the back office as usual. The payphone near the door still worked, one of the few remaining relics of analog privacy. Marcus fed quarters into the machine and dialed Elena's number. The digits burned into his memory, along with dozens of other crucial pieces of information that he carried like survival tools. Marcus! Her voice was small, frightened, speaking Spanish in the particular dialect of their childhood, before the bad years, before the separation, before they'd learned that languages could be weapons as well as shields. I'm here. What's wrong? It's happening again. The man, the coordinator, he's found me. The payphone receiver suddenly felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's hand. The coordinator. The voice that haunted his recordings. The figure who had moved them between different operations like chess pieces, the ghost who had taught him that survival sometimes meant learning to speak without an accent that revealed where you'd been. Elena, where are you? Still with the family. But he called, said he has work for me, said I've learned enough English now to be useful again. Her voice cracked. Marcus, I can't go back to that. I can't. You won't. I promise. Listen to me, do you still have the phone I gave you, the old one? Yes. Turn on the recording app. Keep it running. Record everything, his voice, any conversations, anything that might help. Can you do that? Yes. But Marcus, what if he takes me before anyone can help? What if... Elena. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned to be strong, because strength was the only alternative to breaking. I've been preparing, documenting everything, building a case. When the time comes, we'll have what we need. What kind of case? Marcus looked at his notebook, at 4 years of careful observation, at the iPod that contained recordings in 5 languages, at the pattern of evidence that was slowly forming into something larger than either of them could handle alone. The kind that ends this, all of it, for us, and for every other kid still trapped in the system. He could hear Eleanor breathing, trying to stay calm. How long? Soon. Very soon. There's a teacher at my school. She's been challenging me, pushing me, trying to prove I'm lying about the languages. She doesn't know it yet, but she's going to help us. How? Marcus smiled grimly. She's going to force me to prove what I can do. And when I do, when I demonstrate exactly how I learned 5 languages, there are going to be people listening who know what questions to ask. He spent 10 more minutes talking Elena through emergency protocols, code words, safe places to go if the coordinator made contact. By the time he hung up, his clothes were dry and the first hints of dawn were beginning to filter through the laundromat's grimy windows. Marcus gathered his belongings and walked out into the morning. His backpack heavy with textbooks and notebooks and the weight of a plan that had been 4 years in the making. He had exactly 6 hours before first period English, 6 hours to finalize the documentation that would transform Mrs. Davidson's classroom skepticism into something much larger and more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. As he walked through empty streets toward the group home, he mentally reviewed the evidence, the recordings, the behavioral patterns, the linguistic analysis that would prove not just his competence, but the specific circumstances that had created it. The network of contacts he'd built through Dr. Singh, through the legal aid clinic, through 3 years of translating for families who reminded him of what he and Elena had lost. Mrs. Davidson wanted proof of his linguistic abilities. She wanted to expose him as a fraud, a troubled kid, making up stories to seem special. She was going to get exactly what she asked for. And once she did, once the truth about how a foster child learns 5 languages became public knowledge, the trap that had been 4 years in the setting would finally close around the people who had stolen his childhood and scattered children like him across a system designed to lose them. The coordinator, the network, the teachers and administrators and social workers who looked at suffering children and saw only problems to be managed rather than human beings to be protected. All of them would learn the same lesson Marcus had absorbed through years of survival. Some truths are too large to be contained, and some children grow up to be more dangerous than anyone expects. The sun was rising over Roosevelt High School as Marcus climbed the front steps, his notebook tucked securely under his arm. In 6 hours, Mrs. Davidson would push him too far, demand proof he couldn't provide, and discover that some students carry secrets that can reshape the world. The trap was set. The evidence was compiled. The network was mapped and documented and ready to be exposed. All that remained was springing it. What moment in this story has caught your attention the most? The way Marcus methodically documents every slight, or the revelation that his sister Elena is still in danger? Comment below and let me know which detail made you most eager to see Mrs. Davidson's downfall, because trust me, what's coming next will exceed every expectation of justice you've ever had. The auditorium of Roosevelt High School smelled like decades of nervous sweat and broken dreams. Its burgundy seats faded to the color of dried blood under harsh fluorescent lights. Parent-teacher conference night had drawn the usual crowd. Tired mothers clutching coffee cups like lifelines, fathers checking phones with the desperate frequency of people who'd rather be anywhere else, and administrators wearing smiles that looked painted on with industrial-strength optimism. Marcus Rivera sat in the back row, officially present as a student volunteer, but actually serving as a translator for the Hernandez family, whose English was still fragile enough that academic jargon became an impenetrable wall. Mrs. Hernandez gripped his arm with grateful fingers as he explained her daughter's algebra scores in rapid Spanish, her relief visible when mathematical concepts became comprehensible through his careful translation. "Gracias, mijo," she whispered. "Without you, we would be lost." Marcus nodded, but his attention was divided. 3 rows ahead, Mrs. Davidson held court at a folding table stacked with grade books and student files, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the particular authority of someone who believed her judgment was both final and infallible. "Realistic expectations," she was saying to the Washingtons, whose son Jerome struggled with reading comprehension. "Some children simply aren't cut out for advanced coursework. Better to focus on practical skills than set him up for failure in classes beyond his capabilities." Dr. Amara Singh sat 2 seats away from Marcus, ostensibly there for her nephew's conference, but actually present because Marcus had sent her a carefully worded text that afternoon. "Documentation phase complete. Activation tonight. Roosevelt HS Auditorium, 7 p.m. She carried a leather portfolio that contained legal documents, but also a digital recorder sophisticated enough to capture conversations across a crowded room. Her dark eyes tracked Mrs. Davidson's movements with the precision of someone who had learned to recognize predatory behavior in academic settings. "Mr. Rivera," a voice interrupted Marcus's observation. Principal Martinez approached with the particular smile that administrators reserve for students they considered success stories. "Thank you for helping tonight. The Hernandez family specifically requested you as translator." "Of course, Mr. Martinez. Always happy to help. Your language skills continue to impress everyone. Mrs. Davidson mentioned you've been quite vocal about your linguistic abilities in her class." Marcus felt the shift in the room's energy, the way conversations subtly quieted when adults sensed drama approaching. Mrs. Davidson's head turned at the mention of her name, her eyes locking onto Marcus with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Ah, Mr. Rivera." She stood, smoothing her skirt with movements that suggested barely controlled irritation. "Since you're here, perhaps you'd like to clarify for Mr. Martinez some of the claims you've been making in my classroom." The auditorium's ambient noise dropped several decibels. Parents and teachers turned to watch with the collective instinct of people witnessing a car accident. Mrs. Hernandez looked confused, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. "What claims?" Principal Martinez asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had mediated countless student-teacher conflicts. Mrs. Davidson's smile sharpened. "Mr. Rivera has been telling the class that he speaks 5 languages fluently. When pressed for details, he becomes quite dramatic. About his supposed linguistic expertise." Dr. Singh's pen stopped moving across her legal pad. She'd been taking notes about her nephew's math progress, but now her attention focused entirely on the developing confrontation. 5 languages? Principal Martinez raised his eyebrows. "That's quite impressive, Marcus. Which ones?" Marcus remained seated, his voice calm despite the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. "English, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, and Russian." The silence that followed was electric. Mrs. Davidson's laugh filled the space like breaking glass. "You see?" She gestured toward Marcus, as if presenting evidence in a trial. "Elaborate fantasies. When I asked him to demonstrate these supposed abilities, he mumbled a few phrases that could have been copied from any translation website. "Mjawish, actually," Marcus said quietly, standing with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to move carefully in dangerous spaces, "I demonstrated fluency in all 5 languages. You dismissed the demonstration because you couldn't understand what I was saying." Mrs. Davidson's face flushed. "Mr. Rivera, manufacturing linguistic abilities doesn't make you special. It makes you dishonest." "Patricia," Principal Martinez's voice carried a warning note. "Perhaps we should..." "No, Robert. This is exactly the problem with our current educational approach. We enable these children's fantasies instead of helping them develop realistic expectations. Foster children often create elaborate stories to compensate for unstable backgrounds." The words hung in the air like a slap. Several parents shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hernandez's grip on Marcus's arm tightened, her protective instincts triggered, even though she couldn't follow the English conversation. "Doctor." Singh closed her legal pad and stood, her movement drawing Mrs. Davidson's attention. "I'm sorry," Dr. Singh said, her voice carrying the particular precision of someone accustomed to courtrooms. "Did you just suggest that foster children are inherently dishonest about their capabilities?" Mrs. Davidson's eyes narrowed. "And you are." Dr. Amara Singh, forensic linguist and child advocacy attorney. She extended a business card with the casual authority of someone who had learned to establish credentials quickly. "I couldn't help but overhear your assessment of this young man's linguistic claims. Dr. Singh, I appreciate your expertise, but I've been teaching for over 20 years. I know when students are fabricating accomplishments." "How interesting." Dr. Singh's smile was sharp as a scalpel. "In my professional experience, children who claim multilingual abilities usually have very specific reasons for possessing them, often traumatic ones." Mrs. Davidson stepped forward, her professional composure cracking. "Are you questioning my judgment?" "I'm questioning your methodology. What specific assessments did you use to determine that Marcus was lying about his linguistic competence?" I don't need formal assessments to recognize fabrication when I see it. The auditorium had gone completely quiet now. Even the administrators had stopped shuffling papers. Everyone sensed that something larger was happening, though most couldn't identify exactly what. Marcus looked at Dr. Singh, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The moment had arrived, the confrontation he had been documenting and preparing for over 3 months of careful observation. "Mrs. Davidson," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension with unexpected authority. "You've called me a liar in front of my peers, my principal and members of this community. You've dismissed my abilities without proper assessment and made assumptions about my character based on my background in foster care. Mr. Rivera, I think you should... You've had 3 months to evaluate my actual linguistic competence. Instead, you've chosen to assume that a foster child couldn't possibly possess skills that don't fit your predetermined categories." Mrs. Davidson's voice rose. "How dare you! I'm formally requesting a public demonstration of my linguistic abilities to be evaluated by qualified professionals." Marcus's words carried the weight of months of preparation. Dr. Singh is a forensic linguist. Principal Martinez speaks Spanish fluently. Mrs. Chen teaches Mandarin at the community college and is here tonight for her daughter's conference. He gestured toward the crowd, identifying resources Mrs. Davidson hadn't realized were present. "If I can demonstrate native-level fluency in all 5 languages, will you publicly acknowledge your error in judgment?" Mrs. Davidson felt the trap closing around her, though she couldn't yet see its full dimensions. Every instinct told her to de-escalate, to find a graceful exit from a confrontation that had grown beyond her control. But her pride, wounded by 3 months of subtle challenges from a student who refused to stay in his assigned category, demanded vindication. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with anger. "But when you fail, and you will fail, I expect you to acknowledge that this entire performance has been an elaborate deception designed to manipulate sympathy and avoid accountability for your actual academic performance." Principal Martinez stepped forward. "Patricia, perhaps we should handle this privately." "No," Dr. Singh interrupted, her legal training recognizing the importance of public record. "This is an excellent opportunity for educational assessment. Marcus, are you comfortable proceeding?" Marcus nodded, pulling out his notebook and the device that looked like a broken iPod. "I'll need to make some recordings for documentation purposes." "Recordings?" Mrs. Davidson's voice sharpened with suspicion. "Academic protocol," Dr. Singh said smoothly. "Linguistic assessments should be preserved for analysis." What happened next transformed a simple parent-teacher conference into something that would be remembered at Roosevelt High School for decades. Marcus began speaking in Mandarin, his tones precise and natural as he discussed educational philosophy with Mrs. Chen, who responded with obvious surprise at his fluency. He switched to Arabic, engaging Dr. Singh's colleague, who had arrived late and happened to be a native speaker from Jordan. But it was when he began speaking Russian that the atmosphere in the auditorium changed completely. Marcus's voice took on a different quality, harder, more careful, with specific pronunciations that suggested familiarity with Moscow streets rather than academic instruction. He was discussing educational bureaucracy, but his accent carried undertones that made Dr. Singh lean forward with sudden, sharp attention. Because Dr. Singh recognized those speech patterns. She had heard them before in very specific contexts. Testimonies from trafficking victims, refugees with particular trauma histories, children who had learned languages not through privilege, but through survival in places where speaking incorrectly could mean punishment or worse. Mrs. Davidson, who understood none of the languages being demonstrated, watched the faces around her with growing unease. The skeptical expressions had been replaced by something else: concern, recognition, and in Dr. Singh's case, the careful attention of a professional who was beginning to understand exactly what she was witnessing. "Remarkable," Mrs. Chen said in English. "His Mandarin carries Beijing dialect markers, typically acquired through immersion." The Arabic speaker nodded grimly. Syrian regional patterns. Very specific, not something learned from textbooks. Doctor. Singh's recorder had been running throughout the demonstration, capturing not just the languages, but the reactions, the professional assessments, the mounting evidence that Marcus Rivera's linguistic abilities came from sources no child should ever have to access. Mr. Rivera, she said quietly, thank you for that demonstration. I believe we have sufficient evidence of your competence. Mrs. Davidson looked around the auditorium, sensing that something had shifted, but not understanding what. The faces staring back at her no longer carried the expectant energy of people waiting for a student to be exposed as a fraud. Instead, they wore the careful expressions of adults who had witnessed something troubling and significant. I don't understand, she said. This doesn't prove anything except that he's memorized some phrases. Ma'am, interrupted Officer Rebecca Torres, who had been providing security for the evening and was quietly approaching the group. Doctor, Singh has requested that I listen to this demonstration. I spent 3 years with immigration enforcement, and I've worked with trafficking victims extensively. She looked directly at Mrs. Davidson. What I just heard suggests this young man learned those languages under circumstances that would constitute evidence in a federal investigation. Mrs. Davidson felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Federal investigation? What are you talking about? Marcus stood calmly in the center of the growing circle of adults, his notebook closed, his recording device still running. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had survived things that would break most people and had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. Mrs. Davidson, he said, you wanted proof of how a foster child learns 5 languages. You're about to get exactly what you asked for. The auditorium fell silent, except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whisper of the recorder capturing every word. If you're enjoying this story of justice unfolding, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of truth finally coming to light, because what Mrs. Davidson discovers next about Marcus Rivera's past will change everything she thinks she knows about the children sitting in her classroom. The trap had been sprung, the evidence was being collected, and Mrs. Davidson was about to learn that some students carry secrets that can bring down entire networks of corruption and abuse. But first, she would have to confront the reality that her comfortable assumptions about foster children, trauma, and survival had just collided with a truth too large for her suburban worldview to contain. The authorities had been called, the recording was running, and Marcus Rivera was finally ready to tell his story. Officer Rebecca Torres had seen enough trafficking victims to recognize the signs. The way trauma left invisible fingerprints on a person's voice, the particular caution in their movements, the linguistic competence that came from survival rather than education. As she approached the circle of adults surrounding Marcus Rivera, her radio crackled to life. Unit 47. We need you to secure the scene at Roosevelt High. Federal agents en route. Mrs. Davidson's face went pale. Federal agents? For what? This is a school conference, not some kind of criminal investigation. Ma'am, Officer Torres said quietly, I need you to step back and remain calm. Dr. Singh has contacted the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. This situation is now under federal jurisdiction. The auditorium began to empty as parents gathered their children and hurried toward exits, sensing the kind of trouble that respectable people avoided. But several figures remained. Dr. Singh with her recorder still running, Principal Martinez with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid, worried Spanish, and Mrs. Chen taking notes with the methodical precision of someone who understood she was witnessing something historically significant. Marcus remained in the center of it all, his notebook clutched against his chest, his expression calm despite the chaos erupting around him. Mrs. Hernandez had refused to leave, standing beside him like a protective guardian angel and murmuring prayers in Spanish. This is insane, Mrs. Davidson said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "You're destroying this child's reputation over academic performance issues. This is exactly the kind of enabling behavior that Patricia." The voice that cut through her protests belonged to Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, who had just entered through the auditorium's rear doors with the particular authority that came from federal credentials and 15 years of investigating crimes that most people couldn't imagine. "Please step away from the minor." Agent Chen was a small woman with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen enough human cruelty to recognize it from across a room. She approached Marcus with the careful movements of someone who understood that trafficking survivors often carried invisible wounds that could be triggered by sudden gestures or loud voices. "Marcus," she said softly, "I'm Agent Chen with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Dr. Singh contacted us about some recordings you might have. Are you willing to speak with us?" Marcus nodded, his hand moving instinctively to the device that had masqueraded as a broken iPod for 4 years. "I've been waiting for this conversation for a very long time." Mrs. Davidson stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the transformation of her classroom discipline issue into a federal investigation. "I don't understand what's happening here. This boy has been lying about his linguistic abilities, and now suddenly he's some kind of federal witness." Agent Chen turned to look at her with the expression of someone evaluating a particularly distasteful piece of evidence. "Ma'am, are you Patricia Davidson, English teacher at this institution?" "Yes, I am, and I demand to know." "You're going to need to remain available for questioning. Your interactions with this student may be relevant to our investigation." The words hit Mrs. Davidson like a physical blow. "My interactions? I'm a teacher. I've done nothing wrong except maintain academic standards and realistic expectations for troubled students." "Doctor." Singh looked up from her legal pad, where she had been transcribing the linguistic demonstration with professional precision. "Agent Chen, I think you should hear the recordings immediately. The linguistic markers suggest specific geographic exposure that could help identify trafficking routes." "What recordings?" Mrs. Davidson's voice cracked. "What are you people talking about?" Marcus reached into his backpack and withdrew the device, its cracked screen and tangled earbuds suddenly looking less like teenage poverty and more like sophisticated camouflage. "This contains 4 years of documentation, conversations, locations, voices, everything I could preserve." Agent Chen accepted the device with the reverence of someone handling evidence that could reshape multiple investigations. "Marcus, before we proceed, you need to understand that what you're about to share will likely trigger a complex legal process. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing for 4 years." "And your sister, Elena Rivera?" Marcus's careful composure cracked slightly. "She's in danger. The coordinator found her. He's planning to move her again." Mrs. Davidson felt reality shift beneath her feet like sand. "Sister? Coordinator? What coordinator?" Agent Chen ignored her, speaking into her radio with the rapid precision of someone coordinating a multi-jurisdictional operation. "Control, we need immediate protection detail for Elena Rivera, currently in foster placement in Maryland. Subject is at immediate risk from organized trafficking network." She looked back at Marcus. "We've been tracking the coordinator for 3 years. His voice is on your recordings?" "Extensively, in 4 languages, along with location markers, operational details, and financial transactions." "Financial transactions?" Agent Chen's eyebrows rose. Marcus opened his notebook to a page covered in neat columns of numbers and dates. "I recorded everything. Bank routing numbers read aloud during phone calls, drop locations discussed in different languages, payment schedules for transporters." Mrs. Davidson sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "This can't be happening. This is a school conference. This is about academic honesty." "Ma'am," Agent Chen said, finally giving her full attention, "how long have you been dismissing this student's accounts of his linguistic abilities?" "3 months. He was obviously lying. Foster children often fabricate accomplishments to seem special. Foster children. Agent Chen's voice carried a dangerous edge. You assumed he was lying because he was a foster child. Children from unstable backgrounds often develop manipulative behaviors. I was protecting him from unrealistic expectations. Dr. Singh looked up from her notes, her expression combining professional disgust with personal recognition. Agent Chen, I think Mrs. Davidson needs to understand something about trauma responses and linguistic acquisition. She turned to face the teacher directly. Children don't learn 5 languages fluently by choice. That level of competence requires immersion, desperation, survival. Marcus didn't acquire these skills in some elite academic program. He learned them because not learning them meant death or worse. The auditorium fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens approaching the school. Mrs. Davidson stared at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. Not a troubled foster child making excuses, but a survivor carrying evidence that could bring down the people who had destroyed his childhood. You're saying he was, she whispered, trafficked, Agent Chen confirmed, for approximately 4 years, between ages 12 and 16. Moved between different criminal organizations that spoke different languages. He learned to survive by becoming linguistically invisible, speaking without accent, adapting to whatever environment would keep him alive. Marcus spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. I learned Arabic from the men who moved children through Syrian refugee camps, Mandarin from the organization that ran operations on the West Coast, Russian from the group that handled transportation between cities. Mrs. Davidson's face went white. Oh my God. The coordinator you've been hearing about, Agent Chen continued, is the man who managed Marcus's movement between different operations. We believe he's also responsible for Eleanor's current placement. Placement? Mrs. Davidson's voice was barely a whisper. Foster families that aren't actually families, Marcus said. Safe houses that aren't actually safe. Social workers who aren't actually social workers. The system that's supposed to protect children like Elena and me has been compromised by people who profit from our trauma. The auditorium doors opened again, admitting 2 more federal agents and a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the particular authority of someone accustomed to courtrooms and congressional hearings. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, she introduced herself. I prosecute trafficking cases for the Eastern District. Dr. Singh contacted my office about a potential witness with extensive documentation of organized trafficking operations. She looked at Marcus with the careful attention of someone evaluating evidence that could make or break a career-defining case. Son, I need you to understand the magnitude of what you're offering. If your recordings contain what Dr. Singh believes they contain, you're not just providing evidence for one case, you're potentially exposing an entire network. Marcus nodded. That's exactly what I'm doing. Mrs. Davidson stood slowly, her movements uncertain. I need to call my husband. I need to... Ma'am, Agent Chen said gently, your husband Richard is currently a person of interest in this investigation. The words hit Mrs. Davidson like a physical blow. She stumbled, catching herself against the back of a chair. Richard? My ex-husband Richard? Dr. Richard Davidson. Linguistic consultant, specializes in accent modification and regional dialect elimination. He's been working with trafficking operations to train children to speak without identifiable geographic markers. Mrs. Davidson's world collapsed in that moment. Not just her assumptions about Marcus, but everything she thought she knew about her own life. The man she had married, divorced, still occasionally spoke to about mundane matters, was the coordinator who had destroyed the childhoods of Marcus and Elena and dozens of other children. The reason you reacted so strongly to Marcus's linguistic abilities, Dr. Singh said quietly, wasn't just academic skepticism. Your unconscious mind recognized speech patterns your ex-husband had described from his work. You were responding to trauma markers he had taught you to identify. Marcus looked at Mrs. Davidson with something approaching sympathy. You weren't just dismissing my abilities. You were protecting yourself from recognizing what they represented. The recording device sat on the table between them like a bomb waiting to explode. 4 years of evidence, voices, locations, transactions. The complete map of a trafficking network that had operated in plain sight, protected by the assumption that foster children were unreliable witnesses and that trauma made victims into liars. Agent Chen attached the device to a specialized laptop, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Marcus, I need you to walk me through the organization of these files. We'll need to cross-reference voices with known suspects, geographic markers with active cases." "I've already done that," Marcus said, opening his notebook to reveal page after page of meticulous cross-references. 4 years of correlation analysis. Every voice matched with location data, every conversation linked to specific operations. D.A. Martinez leaned forward. "Son, do you understand what you've just handed us?" "Justice," Marcus said simply, "for Elena and every other child still trapped in the system." "Mrs." Davidson sank back into her chair, her professional world shattered, her personal life revealed as a construction built on lies she had been too comfortable to question. Around her, federal agents began the methodical process of turning a high school auditorium into a command center for an investigation that would span multiple states and destroy the network that had stolen Marcus Rivera's childhood. But first, they would have to follow the evidence wherever it led, including to the suburban home where Mrs. Davidson had once shared meals and conversations with a man who taught children to speak like ghosts, without accents that might reveal the places where their innocence had been murdered. The machinery of justice had begun its inexorable turn, and Patricia Davidson was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous students are the ones who survive long enough to remember everything. The portable command center that had materialized in Roosevelt High School's auditorium hummed with the efficiency of federal machinery in motion. Laptops glowed like altars around which agents bent in technological prayer, their screens displaying waveform analyses, geographical mappings, and the complex web of connections that Marcus Rivera's 4 years of documentation had preserved in digital amber. De Martinez pulled on latex gloves before handling the recording device, treating it with the reverence reserved for evidence that could reshape multiple prosecutions. "Marcus, I need you to understand that what we're about to hear may be difficult for you to relive. We can arrange for trauma counseling." "I've been living with these voices for 4 years, Marcus interrupted quietly. "Playing them back won't make them worse." Agent Chen's laptop displayed a sophisticated audio analysis program that could isolate individual voices from background noise, enhance whispered conversations, and identify linguistic patterns with forensic precision. "We'll start with the most recent recordings and work backward. Can you provide context for each file?" Marcus opened his notebook to a page marked with red tabs, his system for cataloging the most dangerous evidence. File 247, recorded 6 weeks ago. Phone conversation between the coordinator and someone he calls the doctor. They're discussing Eleanor. The auditorium fell silent as Agent Chen played the file. The voices that filled the space were tinny through the device's small speakers, but clear enough to make Mrs. Davidson gasp with recognition. The girl has learned enough English now to be useful in different operations. Her accent is almost completely neutralized. Richard Davidson's voice. Her ex-husband's voice, discussing a 16-year-old girl like a commodity being prepared for market. Excellent. The Maryland placement has served its purpose. We can move her next week. Where? Richard's voice on the recording carried the clinical detachment of someone discussing livestock rather than a human being. Chicago operation needs someone bilingual for the academic angle. Rich families want tutors who look innocent but can handle complex assignments. Mrs. Davidson pressed her hands to her mouth, fighting nausea. D.A. Martinez made notes with mechanical precision, while Agent Chen isolated and enhanced specific portions of the conversation. Agent Chen, Dr. Singh said, studying printouts from the audio analysis. The secondary voice shows markers consistent with our Moscow contact, the one we've been tracking through the Brighton Beach operations. Dmitry Kozlov, Agent Chen confirmed. We've been trying to nail him for 2 years. This puts him in direct contact with our domestic coordinator. Marcus watched Mrs. Davidson's face as the reality settled around her like toxic fog. There are 37 similar files, planning sessions, payment discussions, status updates on children being moved between operations. He turned to another page in his notebook. File 194, your ex-husband describing accent modification techniques. He's training other coordinators. Agent Chen queued up the file. Richard Davidson's voice filled the auditorium again, this time lecturing like the linguistics professor he had once been. Regional dialects are fingerprints. A child who speaks with Brooklyn inflections can be traced to New York operations. Syrian refugees carry Aleppo markers. Our job is to make them linguistically invisible. The recording continued for 12 minutes, a masterclass in erasing identity delivered by someone who understood that stealing voices was as effective as stealing lives. He would talk about this at home, Mrs. Davidson whispered. He said he was consulting for refugee services, teaching accent reduction to help immigrants integrate. D.A. Martinez looked up from her legal pad. Mrs. Davidson, did your husband ever bring work materials home, files, recordings, training materials? He had a home office, locked filing cabinets. He said it was confidential linguistic research. We'll need access to that office. We're divorced. I don't live there anymore. But you still have keys. Mrs. Davidson's face crumpled as she realized what was being asked of her. You want me to help you search my ex-husband's home? We want you to help us save children, Agent Chen said bluntly. Starting with Elena Rivera. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing a text message received 2 hours earlier. Elena sent this during the conference. Man came to the house, said we're moving tomorrow. Please help. The message transformed the auditorium's investigative atmosphere into something urgent and desperate. Agent Chen was already speaking into her radio while D.A. Martinez coordinated with Maryland authorities. We need to understand the full scope before we move, Agent Chen said. Marcus, how many children are documented in your recordings? Marcus turned to a section of his notebook marked with black tabs, the death records. 47 confirmed active cases, 12 who didn't survive. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Davidson stared at the notebook as if it had become something radioactive. 12 children, she repeated numbly. The coordinator doesn't like loose ends, Marcus said. Children who learn too much, who remember too much, who might eventually testify. D.A. Martinez closed her eyes briefly, calculating the prosecutorial implications. Marcus, these recordings, do they include discussions of the murders? File 089, planning session for eliminating a witness, a 14-year-old boy who had started talking to a school counselor about his previous families. The file played for 37 seconds. Enough to make Agent Chen pause the recording and step away from the laptop, her professional composure cracking slightly. Jesus Christ, she whispered. Dr. Singh looked up from her linguistic analysis. Agent Chen, I've identified at least 6 different regional accents in the coordinator's voice across these recordings. He's not just training children to be linguistically invisible, he's trained himself. Each recording shows different speech patterns depending on which operation he's discussing, meaning he's been moving between different criminal organizations for years, possibly decades. This isn't just trafficking, this is organized crime at the highest levels. Marcus opened his notebook to a diagram that looked like a corporate organizational chart, but instead of departments and divisions, it showed trafficking routes, age demographics, and profit margins. I spent 4 years mapping the network, 7 different organizations, 19 cities, operations in 12 countries. D.A. Martinez studied the diagram with the expression of someone watching her career-defining case materialize before her eyes. Son, you've just handed us the Rosetta Stone for international child trafficking. "That's not why I did it," Marcus said quietly. "I did it to find Elena." Agent Chen returned to the laptop, her professional composure restored. "Let's focus on immediate actionable intelligence. Which recordings contain current operational details?" Marcus guided her through files that painted a picture of sophisticated criminal enterprise operating under the cover of legitimate social services. Foster agencies that existed only on paper, group homes that moved children like inventory, social workers who filed reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. "File 301, Marcus said. "Recorded 3 days ago." The coordinator discussing payment schedules. Richard Davidson's voice filled the auditorium once more, this time reading bank routing numbers and cryptocurrency wallet addresses, while discussing the transfer prices for children categorized by age, appearance and linguistic competence. English speakers under 14, premium rate, bilingual teenagers, specialized market pricing, Arabic speakers, particular demand for academic tutoring arrangements. Mrs. Davidson stood abruptly, stumbling toward the auditorium's exit. She made it halfway before vomiting into a trash can, her body rejecting not just the horror of what she was hearing, but the recognition of her own complicity. She had lived with this man, shared meals with him, listened to him describe his work with refugees and immigrants. She had even felt proud of his linguistic expertise, his ability to help people integrate into American society. "Mrs. Davidson," Dr. Singh called softly, "this isn't your fault. These operations depend on legitimate people not recognizing what they're seeing." "But I should have known," she whispered. "I'm an educator. I'm supposed to protect children." Marcus looked at her with something approaching sympathy. "You couldn't have known because the system is designed to hide the truth. Foster children are taught that no one will believe us. Teachers are taught that we're unreliable. Social workers are overloaded with cases they can't properly investigate." He gestured toward his notebook. "The perfect crime isn't complicated. It just requires everyone to assume that suffering children are lying." Agent Chen had been running voice recognition software while they spoke, cross-referencing Marcus's recordings with FBI databases of known criminals. The results painted a picture of criminal cooperation that spanned organized crime families, international trafficking rings, and corrupt officials in positions designed to protect children. "Marcus," she said, "how many of these voices can you identify by name?" "All of them. Names, descriptions, behavioral patterns. I learned to read people the way other kids learn to read books." "And you're willing to testify?" Marcus nodded. "I've been preparing to testify for 4 years. I know every detail of every operation. I can identify voices in lineups. I can map trafficking routes from memory." D.A. Martinez closed her legal pad, the weight of prosecutorial responsibility settling around her shoulders. "Agent Chen, we need to coordinate with international authorities immediately, and we need to move on Elena's location tonight." "Agreed. But first..." Agent Chen turned to Mrs. Davidson, who had returned from the trash can, pale but determined. "Mrs. Davidson, we need access to your ex-husband's home office. Tonight." "He's traveling," she said quietly. "Some kind of consulting work in Chicago. He won't be back until Thursday." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. While they analyzed his crimes, Richard Davidson was probably in Chicago, preparing Elena's next placement. "That gives us a window," Agent Chen said. "Mrs. Davidson, are you willing to cooperate with a search of the premises?" Mrs. Davidson looked at Marcus, at the notebook full of evidence, at the laptop displaying waveforms that represented 4 years of carefully preserved horror. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone whose entire worldview had collapsed in a single evening. "Yes," she said, "I'll help you get the son of a bitch." The recording device sat silent on the table, having delivered its payload of truth like a bomb that would continue exploding through courtrooms and congressional hearings for years to come. But first, it would have to save Elena Rivera, who was scheduled to disappear forever in less than 12 hours. The evidence had been dropped. The network had been exposed. And somewhere in Chicago, the coordinator who had built his career on erasing children was about to learn that some voices refuse to be silenced. Marcus Rivera closed his notebook and prepared to guide federal agents through 4 years of carefully preserved nightmares, each one bringing him closer to the moment when Elena would finally be safe, and the people who had stolen their childhood would face the kind of justice that comes with mandatory minimum sentences and international warrants. The trap had been sprung. Now came the harvest. At 11:47 p.m., the suburban home of Dr. Richard Davidson looked like any other professor's residence. Tasteful landscaping, academic journals stacked on coffee tables, and the kind of carefully curated intellectualism that spoke of tenure and respectability. The only signs of its transformation into a crime scene were the unmarked vehicles parked strategically around the cul-de-sac and the federal agents moving through shadows with the precision of people who understood that evidence could disappear faster than lives. Mrs. Patricia Davidson's hands shook as she inserted her key into the front door lock. She had kept the keys through 6 months of divorce proceedings, telling herself it was for practical reasons. Forwarded mail, forgotten belongings, the gradual untangling of a 20-year marriage. Now, those keys felt like weapons she was turning against everything she had once believed about her life. "The office is upstairs," she whispered to Agent Chen. "Second door on the right. He always kept it locked, even when we lived together." Agent Torres positioned herself at the front entrance, while 2 additional agents secured the rear of the house. The search would be methodical, documented, legally bulletproof, the kind of evidence collection that could survive appeals and international extradition proceedings. Dr. Singh remained in the command center they had established in the Roosevelt High Auditorium, coordinating with Maryland authorities who were simultaneously surrounding the house where Elena Rivera waited, unknowing for rescue or disappearance. The timing had to be perfect. Move too early, and other children in the network would vanish before they could be located. Move too late, and Elena would be transferred to Chicago and lost in the system that had already consumed too many young lives. Marcus sat beside Dr. Singh, his notebook open to pages that mapped the coordinator's behavioral patterns. "He'll have backup files," Marcus said quietly, "physical copies of everything important. He doesn't trust digital storage for the most sensitive material." "How do you know?" "Because that's what he taught us. Never keep evidence where it can be hacked or subpoenaed. Always maintain physical control over the most dangerous information." Dr. Singh looked at him with the particular sadness that came from recognizing wisdom that no child should possess. "He trained you well. He trained me to survive. I trained myself to remember." In Richard Davidson's home office, Agent Chen pulled on latex gloves and began the systematic dismantling of a career built on linguistic manipulation and child trafficking. The locked filing cabinets yielded to professional tools, revealing not academic papers, but detailed operational manuals for erasing identity, modifying speech patterns, and transforming traumatized children into untraceable commodities. "Jesus!" Agent Martinez whispered, photographing documents that read like instruction manuals for psychological warfare, training protocols for accent elimination, behavioral modification techniques, punishment schedules for children who resist linguistic reprogramming. Mrs. Davidson stood in the doorway, unable to enter the office, but unwilling to look away from the evidence of her ex-husband's true work. Each document felt like a revelation and an indictment, not just of Richard, but of her own willful blindness. "I heard him on phone calls," she said numbly, "late at night, talking about problem cases and difficult adjustments. I thought he was discussing refugee families struggling with integration." Agent Chen paused in her documentation to look at the woman whose marriage had provided cover for international child trafficking. "Mrs. Davidson, these operations depend on legitimate people not asking too many questions. You're not the first spouse to discover they were married to a monster." But Mrs. Davidson wasn't looking for absolution. She was staring at a photograph pinned to Richard's bulletin board, a group shot of children arranged in neat rows, their faces carefully composed in expressions that might have looked like happiness to someone who didn't know how to read the signs of trauma. "That's from his consulting work," she said, her voice barely audible. He said it was a success story, refugee children who had been successfully integrated into American schools. Agent Chen studied the photograph with trained eyes that could identify victims even when they were posed to look like success stories. "Mrs. Davidson, how many times did your husband travel for consulting work?" "Monthly, sometimes more often. Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. He said he was training other specialists." He was, training coordinators for other trafficking operations. The search continued through the night, each filing cabinet revealing new horrors, financial records showing payments from 12 different criminal organizations, travel documents under multiple identities, and most damning of all, a detailed database of children coded not by name, but by linguistic competence, age, and market value. Marcus Rivera appeared in that database as Subject 247, exceptional linguistic acquisition, high adaptation quotient, suitable for advanced operations requiring cultural invisibility. Elena was Subject 248, rapid English integration, suitable for academic placements, recommend Chicago transition for upscale market penetration. At 2:15 a.m., Dr. Singh's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Maryland. "Package secured, subject safe, coordinator not on premises." Elena was safe. But Richard Davidson remained at large in Chicago, unaware that his entire network was collapsing around him like a house built on sand and lies. Agent Chen emerged from the office carrying a laptop and 3 boxes of documents. "We've got enough evidence to indict half the trafficking operations on the East Coast. Financial records, operational protocols, contact databases. This isn't just trafficking. It's organized crime with international reach." She looked at Mrs. Davidson, who had spent the night transforming from unwitting accomplice to crucial witness. "Mrs. Davidson, your husband kept detailed records of his phone calls with other coordinators. We'll need you to identify voices when we play back-recorded conversations. You want me to help build the case against him. We want you to help save the children still trapped in the system." Mrs. Davidson nodded slowly, the weight of redemption settling around her shoulders like a heavy coat. "What do I need to do?" "For now, act normal. Richard doesn't know we've searched his office. When he returns from Chicago, he needs to believe everything is status quo until we can coordinate arrests across multiple jurisdictions. And if he contacts me..." Agent Chen handed her a device that looked like an ordinary cell phone. "This will record everything. Every call, every text, every contact. We need to document his reaction when he realizes the network has been compromised." Nayde. At Roosevelt High School, Marcus Rivera sat in the auditorium that had become ground zero for the largest child trafficking investigation in federal history. His notebook lay open beside dozens of federal files, his 4 years of careful documentation now integrated into official evidence that would reshape how law enforcement approached missing children cases. "Marcus," Dr. Singh said quietly, "there's something you should know. Elena is safe, but she's asked to speak with you." She handed him a secure phone. Elena's voice came through clear and strong, speaking Spanish with the particular cadence of relief and residual fear. "Hermano, is it over?" "Almost," Marcus replied. "The coordinator is still free, but not for long. How are you?" "Scared, but safe. The agents here, they understand. They've worked with other children like us." "Elena, I need you to know something. Mrs. Davidson, my teacher, she was married to the coordinator. She didn't know what he was doing, but she's helping now. The teacher who didn't believe you could speak 5 languages." Marcus looked across the auditorium at Mrs. Davidson, who was reviewing photographs of trafficking victims with Agent Torres, her face etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from recognizing complicity. She believed what the system taught her to believe, that children like us are unreliable witnesses. And now she knows better. At 4:33 a.m., Richard Davidson's phone rang in his Chicago hotel room. The conversation was brief, professional, concerned with what he believed was routine operational coordination. He had no idea that every word was being recorded by federal agents who had spent the night dismantling his life's work. "The Maryland package is ready for transition," he said into the phone. "Pickup scheduled for 800 hours. "Understood. Chicago team prepared for integration." "Excellent. This subject has premium market potential, linguistic skills, academic presentation, trauma responses within acceptable parameters." The call ended. Richard Davidson returned to sleep, unaware that Elena Rivera was already in federal protection and that the Chicago team he had just spoken with consisted of FBI agents who were coordinating his arrest. By dawn, the trap that Marcus Rivera had spent 4 years setting had closed around not just Richard Davidson, but the entire network he had built through decades of stolen childhoods and erased voices. Financial accounts were frozen. Safe houses were raided. Coordinators in 7 cities woke up to federal agents with warrants and questions about children who had disappeared into systems designed to lose them. Mrs. Patricia Davidson sat in the Roosevelt High Auditorium as the sun rose over a school that would never look the same to her. In 12 hours, her understanding of education, trauma, and the children sitting in her classrooms had been completely reconstructed. "Mrs. Davidson," Marcus said, approaching her with the careful movements of someone who understood forgiveness but didn't require it, "I want you to know that what you did tonight, helping with the search, agreeing to testify, it matters. You helped save Elena and every other child still trapped in the system." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much truth in too short a time. "Marcus, I spent 3 months telling you that foster children are unreliable, that trauma makes people dishonest. You believed what you were taught to believe. But you," her voice cracked, "you were sitting in my classroom, carrying evidence that could save lives, and I dismissed you because of assumptions about your background." Marcus sat beside her in the auditorium seats, where this had all begun, his notebook closed, his recording device finally silent. "Mrs. Davidson, the system is designed to make people like you dismiss people like me. The perfect crime doesn't require criminal conspirators. It just requires good people to believe that suffering children are inherently unreliable." Outside, the first news van pulled into the school parking lot, followed by others as word spread that Roosevelt High School had become the center of an international child trafficking investigation. Soon, there would be reporters, cameras, questions about how one student's linguistic abilities had exposed a network that federal authorities had been hunting for years. But for now, in the quiet moments before the world descended on them, a teacher and her student sat together in an empty auditorium, separated by everything they had been and united by everything they had discovered about truth, evidence, and the dangerous assumptions that allow evil to flourish in plain sight. The fall was complete. The network was exposed. And somewhere in federal custody, Elena Rivera was finally safe to speak in whatever language felt like home. The machinery of justice had turned, powered by 4 years of careful documentation and the quiet courage of a student who had refused to let his voice be erased. Richard Davidson would return from Chicago to find his house surrounded, his accounts frozen, and his life's work transformed into evidence for the prosecution. But first, he would make one final phone call to coordinate Elena's transfer, a conversation that would be recorded by federal agents and played back in courtrooms where his victims would finally have their day in testimony. The trap had closed, the evidence was secured, and Marcus Rivera had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to be silent about what you've survived. The federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore resembled a fortress of marble and steel, its neoclassical columns standing like sentinels against the chaos of a world where justice moved at the speed of bureaucracy. 6 months after the Roosevelt High School auditorium had become the epicenter of the largest child trafficking investigation in federal history, The building's ceremonial courtroom had been transformed into a theater where Marcus Rivera's carefully preserved evidence would finally receive its public hearing. DA Rebecca Martinez stood at the prosecution table, her closing arguments folder thick enough to serve as a weapon. Across from her, 3 defense teams, representing Richard Davidson and his co-conspirators, maintained the kind of professional composure that came with hourly rates exceeding most people's monthly salaries. They had fought every piece of evidence, challenged every witness, questioned every recording with the desperate creativity of lawyers who understood their clients faced mandatory life sentences. Marcus Rivera sat in the witness section, wearing a navy suit that Dr. Singh had helped him select for his testimony. The 17-year-old, who had documented 4 years of horror in 5 languages, now carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived cross-examination by some of the most expensive legal talent money could buy. Mrs. Patricia Davidson occupied a seat in the gallery, her presence serving as both witness and symbol of how willful blindness enabled systematic evil. Over the past 6 months, she had testified before 3 grand juries, provided access to evidence that had led to arrests in 12 countries, and slowly rebuilt her understanding of what it meant to be an educator in a world where children carried secrets that could topple governments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," DA Martinez began, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from prosecuting cases that redefined criminal law. "6 months ago, you were told this case was about organized child trafficking. That was accurate but incomplete." She gestured toward a wall-mounted display showing the network diagram Marcus had created in his notebook, now rendered in government precision with connecting lines, photographs, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption extending far beyond individual criminals. "This case is about systematic betrayal of the most vulnerable members of our society. It's about a network that didn't just traffic children, it infected the very institutions designed to protect them. The evidence presentation took 3 days. Financial records showing payments from trafficking operations to legitimate social service agencies. Audio recordings of Richard Davidson training other coordinators in accent elimination techniques. Testimony from 17 rescued children who spoke in careful voices about learning languages because not learning them meant disappearance. Elena Rivera took the stand on Thursday morning, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands as she identified her brother's recordings. She spoke in English, Spanish, and Arabic, demonstrating the multilingual competence that had made her valuable to traffickers and ultimately led to her rescue. "The coordinator, Dr. Davidson, he would test us," she testified, "make us repeat phrases until our accents disappeared. He said children with accents could be traced back to their operations. We had to become linguistically invisible." Defense attorneys attempted to challenge her credibility, suggesting that trauma had confused her memories, that sibling loyalty had motivated fabrication. But Elena Rivera had inherited her brother's careful attention to detail, and her testimony included specific dates, locations, and conversations that corroborated Marcus's recordings with devastating precision. "Miss Rivera," the lead defense attorney asked during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you've been coached by federal prosecutors to provide testimony that supports their narrative?" Eleanor looked at him with the particular stillness that came from surviving things that would break most adults. "Sir, I've been coached by traffickers to speak without accent markers that might identify my geographic origins. I've been trained to respond to psychological manipulation designed to erase my identity. Testifying about the truth requires no coaching at all." The courtroom fell silent. Even the defense attorney seemed to recognize he had just triggered testimony that would haunt the jury's deliberations. Marcus's testimony began on Friday. For 2 days, he walked the jury through his notebook, explaining how a 12-year-old boy had learned to document evidence while surviving horrors that challenged the limits of human comprehension. "Mr. Rivera, D.A. Martinez asked, "Can you explain to the jury how you learned to speak 5 languages fluently?" Marcus opened his notebook to the first page, where he had written Eleanor's name in Arabic script. "I learned Arabic from men who moved children through refugee camps because speaking with the wrong accent in the wrong place could mean punishment or worse. I learned Mandarin from coordinators who managed West Coast operations because understanding their conversations meant knowing when transfers were planned." He turned the page. "I learned Russian from transporters who moved children between cities because recognizing their discussions about routes and timing meant the difference between escape opportunities and permanent disappearance." "And how did you document these languages?" Marcus held up the device that had masqueraded as a broken iPod. "My sister Elena gave me this during our last moments together before separation. I thought I was preserving memories of her voice. I was actually creating a digital map of the entire trafficking network." The defense's case collapsed under the weight of evidence Marcus had preserved with systematic precision. Financial records corroborated his testimony about payment schedules. Voice recognition software confirmed identities he had provided from memory. Geographic markers in his recordings matched trafficking routes that federal agents had spent years trying to map. Dr. Richard Davidson took the stand in his own defense, attempting to portray himself as a linguistics expert who had been manipulated by criminals claiming to need legitimate accent reduction services. His testimony lasted 3 hours and destroyed any remaining sympathy the jury might have harbored. "Dr. Davidson," D.A. Martinez asked during cross-examination, "are you familiar with Subject 247 in your database?" "I don't recall that designation." Subject 247 was Marcus Rivera. "Your notes indicate exceptional linguistic acquisition, high adaptation quotient, suitable for advanced operations requiring cultural invisibility." Does that sound like legitimate accent reduction consulting? Davidson's silence stretched long enough for the jury to understand that some questions answered themselves. The verdict came after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit human trafficking, racketeering, kidnapping, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise. The judge's sentence was delivered with the particular gravity reserved for crimes that challenged society's fundamental assumptions about protection and predation. Dr. Richard Davidson, you have been convicted of orchestrating a criminal network that trafficked children across international borders, erased their identities through psychological manipulation, and corrupted institutions designed for their protection. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Similar sentences followed for his co-conspirators: financial penalties that would fund victim services for decades, asset forfeiture that would compensate survivors for childhood stolen and innocents murdered. But the real cleanup happened outside the courthouse, in congressional hearings, where Marcus Rivera's testimony led to comprehensive reform of foster care oversight, in international agreements that created new protocols for identifying trafficking victims, in training programs that taught social workers and educators to recognize trauma markers rather than dismiss them as behavioral problems. Mrs. Patricia Davidson returned to Roosevelt High School, but not to the same classroom. She now taught a specialized program for students who had aged out of foster care, using Marcus's documentation methods to help other survivors preserve their stories and advocate for systematic change. "Mrs. Davidson," a new student asked during her first day, "why do you always ask us to document everything?" She looked at the 17-year-old whose file indicated multiple placement changes and academic struggles that she now understood might indicate survival skills rather than behavioral problems. "Because your voice matters," she said. "Because truth has power when it's carefully preserved. And because sometimes the most important evidence is carried by the people society has been taught not to believe." The student nodded, Opening a notebook with the careful attention of someone who had learned that documentation could mean the difference between being believed and being dismissed. Dr. Amara Singh established the Rivera Foundation, using settlement funds from the trafficking case to provide legal services for child survivors. Marcus and Elena served as youth coordinators, training other survivors to document their experiences and navigate legal systems that had been redesigned to listen rather than dismiss. The cleanup extended beyond individual justice to systematic reform. Foster care agencies implemented new oversight protocols. Social workers received training in trauma recognition. Educators learned to identify signs of trafficking rather than assume that multilingual abilities in disadvantaged children indicated academic dishonesty. Marcus Rivera graduated from Roosevelt High School valedictorian, his commencement speech delivered in 5 languages to an audience that included federal agents, trafficking survivors, and educators who had learned to recognize strength disguised as struggle. He enrolled at Georgetown University on a full scholarship, double majoring in international law and forensic linguistics. Elena Rivera, now safely placed with a family that understood her history, began writing a memoir about linguistic survival and sibling loyalty. Her book proposal had already attracted interest from publishers who recognized that some stories needed to be preserved not just for their literary merit, but for their capacity to prevent future atrocities. The courthouse steps where Marcus had given his first press conference after the verdict became a gathering place for trafficking survivors sharing their stories with media that had learned to listen rather than sensationalize. Each testimony added weight to legislative efforts that treated child trafficking as a national security issue requiring federal coordination rather than local social services. But perhaps the most significant cleanup happened in classrooms across the country, where teachers looked at struggling students and asked new questions. Not, "What's wrong with this child?" but, "What has this child survived?" Not, "Why can't they focus?" but, "What skills have they developed that we don't recognize?" The network that had operated for decades through systematic dismissal of child testimony crumbled under the weight of evidence that Marcus Rivera had preserved through 4 years of careful documentation. His notebook, now preserved in federal archives, served as a template for other survivors learning to document their experiences and demand accountability from systems designed to protect them. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the mechanisms that had enabled systematic abuse had been dismantled and rebuilt with transparency and accountability. The cleanup was complete, but the work of prevention continued in every classroom where teachers learned to see potential rather than problems, in every courtroom where survivor testimony was treated as credible evidence rather than unreliable accusation. Marcus Rivera closed his final high school notebook and opened a new one labeled Georgetown University, International Justice Studies. The boy who had learned 5 languages to survive had become a young man whose voice carried the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systematic change. The cleanup was complete. The network was destroyed. And somewhere in federal prison, Richard Davidson spent his days in solitary confinement, his ability to manipulate language reduced to conversations with guards who had been specifically trained to recognize manipulation techniques in their training materials. Authored by Marcus Rivera, The Most Perfect Form of Justice, the victim becoming the educator, the survivor transforming trauma into truth, and the voice that traffickers had tried to erase becoming the testimony that brought down their entire operation. 5 years after the night when a broken iPod became the key that unlocked international justice, Marcus Rivera stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. The 22-year-old Georgetown law graduate carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had transformed personal survival into global advocacy, his voice now recognized in diplomatic circles as the definitive authority on child trafficking prevention. Honorable delegates, he began, his words simultaneously translated into dozens of languages by interpreters who understood they were witnessing history. 5 years ago, I was subject 247 in a database that reduced children to market commodities. Today, I stand before you as proof that some voices refuse to be silenced, and some truths are too powerful to be contained. Oduduzi, the assembly hall fell silent, except for the whisper of translation equipment carrying his testimony across linguistic barriers to representatives from 193 countries. In the gallery, Dr. Amara Singh sat beside Elena Rivera, now a published author whose memoir had become required reading in social work programs across 6 continents. Mrs. Patricia Davidson occupied a seat in the educators section, her attendance sponsored by the UNESCO Commission on Trafficking Prevention. The former high school English teacher had spent the past 5 years redesigning educational protocols for identifying trafficking victims. Her training programs, now implemented in school districts across 47 states. The network we dismantled operated for decades through one fundamental assumption, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the particular precision of someone who understood that every word would be analyzed by policymakers and prosecutors. That society would dismiss the testimony of traumatized children as unreliable fabrication rather than credible evidence. Behind him, a massive display screen showed the global impact of what had begun in a Roosevelt High School auditorium. 237 children rescued across 19 countries. Trafficking networks dismantled in 43 cities. Legislative reforms that had fundamentally altered how law enforcement approached missing children cases. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the individual transformations that rippled outward from Marcus Rivera's 4 years of careful documentation. In Chicago, Agent Sarah Chen had been promoted to head the FBI's International Human Trafficking Task Force. Her success measured not just in arrests, but in prevention programs that identified at-risk children before they could be recruited. Her office walls displayed photographs of survivors who had become advocates, their faces reflecting the particular strength that came from transforming trauma into purpose. In Baltimore, DA Rebecca Martinez had parlayed her prosecution of the Davidson network into a federal appointment overseeing international justice coordination. Her desk bore a paperweight made from Marcus's original recording device, the broken iPod that had become the foundation for the most comprehensive trafficking prosecution in legal history. But perhaps the most profound transformation had occurred in Richard Davidson himself. 5 years of solitary confinement in ADX Florence had reduced the former linguistics professor to a shadow of his academic arrogance. His days were spent in an 8-by-12-foot cell, his ability to manipulate language restricted to conversations with guards who had been specifically trained to recognize his psychological techniques. The irony wasn't lost on federal psychologists who evaluated him annually. The man who had stolen children's voices had been rendered essentially mute, his own words now preserved only in legal transcripts that documented his crimes with clinical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus continued, his voice strengthening as he approached the crescendo of 5 years of careful preparation, "the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child declares that every child has the right to be heard, but rights without mechanisms for enforcement are merely aspirations." He gestured toward the gallery where 37 trafficking survivors sat in seats reserved for official witnesses. Each had been rescued through investigations that traced back to evidence Marcus had preserved in his notebook. Each now served as an advocate for children still trapped in systems designed to lose them. Therefore, I propose the establishment of the International Child Testimony Protection Protocol, a framework that treats child survivors as credible witnesses rather than damaged goods, that preserves their evidence with forensic precision, and that creates legal pathways for their voices to reach the highest levels of international justice. The proposal had been 5 years in development, crafted through collaboration between survivors, legal experts, and child psychologists, who understood that traditional legal frameworks often failed the very people they claimed to protect. Its implementation would create safe harbors for child witnesses, specialized courts for trafficking cases, and mandatory training for officials who interacted with potential victims. Elena Rivera watched her brother from the gallery, her own transformation visible in the confident way she held herself. The 16-year-old, who had once been scheduled for disappearance into Chicago trafficking operations, now served as youth coordinator for the Rivera Foundation, her memoir having sold over 2 million copies worldwide and triggered legislative hearings in 17 countries. The boy who learned 5 languages to survive, she had written in her book's final chapter, became the man whose voice carried far enough to reach every child still waiting for rescue. And as Marcus concluded his presentation, delegates from 127 countries signed preliminary agreements to implement the protocol within their domestic legal systems. The remaining nations faced economic sanctions that would make continued tolerance of trafficking networks financially impossible. But the real victory was measured not in diplomatic signatures, but in the quiet moments after formal proceedings ended, when survivors approached Marcus with stories of their own transformations. A 19-year-old from Cambodia who had learned to document abuse through drawings because she couldn't yet write. A 15-year-old from Nigeria who had preserved evidence of trafficking routes in songs that seemed like children's games to adult ears. Each survivor carried evidence that expanded the growing database of trafficking intelligence that now informed Interpol operations worldwide. The notebook Marcus had started as a 12-year-old boy trying to preserve his sister's voice, had evolved into a global documentation network that made child trafficking significantly more difficult and infinitely more dangerous for perpetrators. Mrs. Davidson approached Marcus after the formal ceremony, her movement careful in the way of someone who understood she existed in his life by grace rather than right. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to know something. Every day for 5 years, I've looked at the students in my classroom and asked myself, what am I missing? What stories are they carrying that I'm not educated enough to recognize?" Marcus studied her with the same careful attention he had once reserved for potential threats. "And what have you found? That every child is carrying something: trauma, talent, dreams, evidence, sometimes all of the above. My job isn't to judge their credibility. It's to create space for their voices to be heard." She paused, looking out over the assembly hall, where delegates discussed implementation timelines and enforcement mechanisms. "The boy in my classroom who claimed to speak 5 languages, he was trying to tell me something much larger than linguistic competence. He was trying to tell me that children survive things adults can't imagine, and that survival creates capabilities we're not educated to recognize." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of recognition in her words. "Mrs. Davidson, you helped save Elena. You helped build the case that brought down the network. You've spent 5 years redesigning education to prevent what happened to us from happening to other children. It wasn't enough to erase my initial failure." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it was enough to prevent future failures. And sometimes that's how justice works, not by erasing damage, but by ensuring it never happens again." As delegates filed out of the assembly hall, carrying with them legislation that would reshape international law enforcement, Marcus Rivera stood alone at the podium where his journey from victim to advocate had reached its crescendo. The boy who had learned 5 languages because not learning them meant death had become the man whose voice carried far enough to protect children he would never meet in countries he might never visit. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Hermano, I'm proud of you, but more than that, I'm grateful. You kept your promise." The promise he had made 5 years earlier in a payphone conversation from a laundromat at 3 a.m. that he would build a case strong enough to end the system that had stolen their childhood and scattered children like them across a world designed to lose them. The case was built. The network was destroyed. The system had been dismantled and rebuilt with transparency, accountability, and the revolutionary assumption that children who claimed to have survived impossible things might actually be telling the truth. Marcus Rivera walked out of the United Nations building into a New York evening that sparkled with possibility. Somewhere in federal prison, Richard Davidson sat in solitary confinement, his life's work reduced to evidence in legal textbooks that would teach future prosecutors how to recognize and dismantle trafficking networks. Somewhere in universities and law schools across the globe, students studied the Rivera Documentation Protocol, the systematic approach to preserving evidence that Marcus had developed through 4 years of survival and refined through 5 years of legal education. Somewhere in classrooms around the world, teachers looked at struggling students and asked new questions, listened for signs of trauma disguised as behavioral problems, and created space for voices that society had been conditioned to dismiss. But most importantly, somewhere in safe houses and foster homes and family placements that had been thoroughly vetted through new protocols, children who had once been subjects in criminal databases were learning to use their voices for testimony instead of survival, for advocacy instead of self-preservation, for justice instead of mere endurance. The verdict was final. Some children grow up to be more dangerous than anyone expects, and some truths are too large to be contained by the systems that try to silence them. Marcus Rivera had learned 5 languages to survive. He had used those languages to document evidence that brought down an international trafficking network, and ultimately he had discovered that the most powerful language of all was simply refusing to be silent about what he had survived. The broken iPod that had started as Eleanor's gift to preserve family memories had become the foundation for international justice. The notebook that had begun as a child's attempt to make sense of chaos had evolved into a protocol that protected children worldwide. And the boy who had once been told that foster children were unreliable witnesses had become the man whose testimony reshaped how the world listened to its most vulnerable voices. Justice, Marcus reflected as he walked through the streets of New York City, wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about transformation, of systems that enabled abuse, of assumptions that dismissed victims, and of societies that had been taught to look away from suffering children instead of listening to what they had to say. Fuck around and find out, he thought with the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent a decade proving that some people underestimate survival at their own peril. The coordinator and his network had found out. The world had been fundamentally altered. And somewhere in the growing database of documented voices, another child was learning that their testimony mattered, their evidence was credible, and their survival had prepared them for something larger than anyone, including themselves, could have imagined. The verdict was complete. The voice that traffickers had tried to erase had become the testimony that brought down their entire operation and rebuilt the world's approach to protecting its children. Some truths are too powerful to be silenced. Some children grow up to be more dangerous than evil expects. And sometimes the most perfect justice is simply ensuring that the voices meant to be erased become the ones that reshape everything. Marcus Rivera had kept his promise to Elena, but more than that, he had kept the promise that every trafficked child makes in the darkness of their captivity, that if they survive, they will make sure no other child has to endure what they endured. The promise was kept, the justice was served, and the world was safer because one broken iPod had preserved enough truth to bring down an empire built on stolen childhoods and erased voices. The story was complete, but the work continued, one documented voice at a time, until every child knew their testimony mattered, and every trafficker understood that some secrets are too dangerous to keep.